Dr. Marchangisi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about one aspect of how they violated our civil liberties, which I think stands above all the rest and really changes the complexion of what they being the lockdowners and the authoritarians who thrusted the interventions on us. So I think much worse than having locked us down and shut us down and closed schools and forced masks on us, many of us all day at work, sometimes in hot, sweaty conditions, prevented us from seeing relatives who were sick or in old folks' homes and highly restricted hours, coerced a medication on us, and those who wouldn't bend were fired or banished from society, treated as second or third class citizens. That worse than all of that is that rather than letting the arguments go forth as to whether these are good ideas, instead you pushed for censorship. You pushed to get rid of all of the voices that were opposed to your authoritarian interventions. Right? So in science, this would be like some lab, or like some research lab that's involved in a bunch of ideas, and the ideas are wrong, let's suppose. It turns out later, but they might be humiliated if they're wrong after, let's say, 10 years of doing this work, and it turns out, I was wrong. It's too bad. Now I realize I was wrong, and this other lab, which was saying this other thing, is right? Now, it could have been that. Like, imagine that the lockdowners did all of those things that I just mentioned. Again, lockdowns, shutdowns, violating informed consent en masse, right, and so forth. They did all that, but they still allowed us to argue against them, right? That would be some sense fair play. I mean, I don't think it would be fair play. It's still a violation of civil liberties, but there's a sense in which, at least from a utilitarian standpoint, if one were a utilitarian and I'm not, that would be kind of fair play. It would be like in science, again, just I'm arguing against the other lab, turns out they were wrong, they lose reputation for having been wrong all those years. But now imagine that this other scientist or scientist lab actively went around burning down his or her opponent's labs, right? Just burned them all down. Ensured that there was no funding to any of those labs, right? Made sure that there was no research, no voice opposed to his or her scientific viewpoint. Right? Now, if you manage to do the research despite him or her burning down all the labs that in fact engage in that kind of research, if you do manage to do the needed research and show that, Judy or Fred was wrong, the one that's been burning down all these labs, man, you're going to treat that person, Judy or Fred, much differently than them merely having been wrong. You actively silence all of the scientific voices that were opposed to you. And that is what, in fact, we're dealing with in the case of COVID for the last 3 years. Almost all the voices that pushed lockdowns and shutdowns and civil liberties violating interventions en masse, which were ridiculous on their face, harmful, devastatingly harmful to societies overall, right, weren't just wrong and should lose reputation. They broke the rules in a deeper sense. They reached into the wiring of free expression upon which society rests to find the truth. They ripped out all of those wires. They ripped those wires out and dared to continue doing those interventions while ripping out the very wires that society relies on to right itself, free speech and free expression. Right? Those that pushed for censorship of misinformation, those that are still pushing, because they still are across the world, pushing for censorship of misinformation, are our greatest foes. They are our greatest foes. And those that push for these interventions, as well as pushing for censorship of their opponents' misinformation, should not merely be humiliated and allowing them to rise back. They should wander social media alone, without a voice, for the rest of their life. And that was your Science Moment.